questions. Question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Last week, the governor of the Bank of Canada indicated that inflationary deficits under this government had added to the inflation we're experiencing today. The Prime Minister said it was just because of COVID that he had to create this kind of exorbitant deficit. But 40% of the deficits had nothing to do with COVID, and they're costing each Canadian $350, according to the Governor of the Bank of Canada. Will the government reverse its inflationary deficits so that Canadians can pay their bills? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin the day and the week with good news. This week, on Thursday, December 1st, Canadians can begin applying for a benefit that will allow parents with kids under 12 to claim $600 for dental care. This is excellent news for all Canadians, especially for our children. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Bank of Canada has said that this government's deficit spending is driving inflation, that inflation is costing $3,500 for the average Canadian. And furthermore, we're facing a heat crisis over the winter. The Liberals say they're going to buy everyone a heat pump, but according to McLeod-Lowry Insurance Group, many insurance companies will not accept heat pumps as a main source of heat. That's because they can't be counted on to keep the pipes from freezing. So instead of distracting with promises that won't work, why won't the Liberals cancel their plan to triple the carbon tax and raise home heating prices?
Well, Deputy Prime Minister.
Providing dental care for all Canadian children under 12 is not a promise that won't work. That is a commitment that starts this Thursday, and it means that never again will a Canadian parent of young children need to choose between buying the groceries, paying the rent, or taking their kid to the dentist. That is something for us all to celebrate. When it comes to fiscal responsibility, Canada has a AAA rating and the lowest debt and deficit in the G7.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the question was about home heating. The NDP has voted to raise home heating prices. They voted against our motion to take the carbon tax off home heat, and they did it right before a winter where analysts expect that home heating prices will double. Now the Liberals say they'll buy everyone a heat pump, which insurance companies say will not be insured because you need a backup heat supply in order to keep the pipes from freezing. So instead of coming up with new schemes, why don't they just cancel the tax so Canadians can stay warm this winter?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, and I certainly think that we can all agree that affordability is an incredibly important issue for Canadians, for all Canadians. That is why we have done a number of things, including doubling of the GST benefit, enhancement to the workers' benefit, and investments in energy efficiency to ensure that we are addressing affordability. It's also the case, no matter what the opposition tries to say, that 8 out of 10 Canadian families actually get more money back than they pay in the price on pollution. And I would say every member on that side of the House, including the Leader of the Opposition, campaigned on a platform of putting in place a price on pollution. What does he say to his constituents now?
I don't know. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, I say to my constituents that we want them to have lower, not higher home heating bills. As for his claim, the Parliamentary Budget Officer says that when you take into account both the financial and economic costs of this government's carbon tax, that 60% of people paying it will pay more than they get back in any rebate. That is published information, and it's only going to get worse as the Liberals triple the tax with the help of the NDP. We're headed into a cold winter. Canadians need to heat their homes. It is not a luxury. Will they cancel their plan to triple the tax?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, the honourable member has now made the most bizarre argument I could have possibly imagined when it comes to inaction on climate change. He's now suddenly opposed to heat pumps. Heat pumps have the ability to reduce pollution in our community and bring the cost of power down, or heat, for homeowners who live in my community. This is particularly important as we're coming up on the winter season, and I'm so pleased to have been able to make an announcement in my hometown last week that will provide an upfront grant of up to $5,000 for homeowners to help them lower their heating bills every month. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to do what's right for climate change, but because we know the cost of inaction is simply too great to ignore.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
In the recently published government strategy on the Indo-Pacific, they say, and I quote, "In areas of profound disagreement, we will challenge China, including when it engages in coercive behavior or ignores human rights obligations." There's a wave of protests across China right now, and there are now reports of government crackdowns against those protests. If the government is serious about what it put in its strategy, then will they indicate to Beijing that the peaceful protests should be allowed to go ahead and that any crackdown should be resisted?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
We are following the unfolding events in China very closely. We remain in close contact with our embassy and consulate. We believe in freedom of expression at home and abroad, including in China, and that protesters should be able to peacefully protest and share their views without fearing for their safety. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to follow the events very closely. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, let me sum it all up. According to Global News, there was Chinese interference in the 2019 election. At least 11 candidates are believed to have been funded by China. Intelligence agencies reportedly notified the Prime Minister's office as early as January of this year. We've been trying to get to the bottom of this, but there's no clear answers from the Prime Minister nor from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as if secrecy somehow served democracy. I'll put the question another way. Are we to understand that the Global News story is fake news? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, we take all threats of foreign interference very seriously. And that's why we created not just one, but two independent panels that confirmed the results of both elections, both in 2019 and 2021. And we will continue to provide the National Security Committee all the tools it needs, and the Public Safety Committee as well, so that they can protect our democratic institutions. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, let's say there was no Chinese interference in the financing of 11 candidates, let's just say. But we do know there's a real risk. Just think of the Chinese researchers at the Winnipeg lab, the undercover Chinese police stations in Toronto, or the spying at Hydro-Quebec. To believe there's no threat of Chinese interference in the election process is, let's just say, naive. Instead of bluster, will the government recognize that public funding of political parties would be a good way to protect the integrity of our elections? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, we obviously share the colleagues' sentiments about how important it is to protect our election system and our elections, and that's why our government did take action years back by setting up a panel set up by the Clerk of the Privy Council and intelligence experts, specifically to ensure that Canadian elections are free and open. And that's what was confirmed in 2019, and good news, Mr. Speaker, in 2021 as well.
Member for North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians are struggling to keep up with rising food costs. Canada's biggest grocer, Loblaws, made $556 million in profits in 3 months. While first-time visits to food banks go up by 64%, the Loblaws CEO is just getting richer. The NDP called on the Liberals to make this right and make them pay their fair share, but Canadians have yet to see any action. Will the Liberals stand up with everyday Canadians and make these people pay their fair share?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government is absolutely committed to ensuring that everyone pays their fair share. That's why we are taking action. by permanently raising the tax on financial institutions and insurers by 1.5%, by introducing a Canada Recovery Dividend of 15%, and by introducing a luxury tax on luxury private planes, yachts, and luxury cars. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, the use of food banks is going up all across the country. This affects children, seniors, and low-income families, everybody. Meanwhile, Loblaws is filling its boots at the expense of struggling families. The CEOs and shareholders have benefited from unprecedented profits. Why do the Liberals refuse to make CEOs pay their fair share to help people who are hungry? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Because they don't.
Mr. Speaker, our government undertook to make everyone pay their fair share, and we did exactly that. We increased the corporate income tax rate by 1.5% and for banking and financial institutions, and we also introduced a 15% Canada Recovery Dividend, and we also put a luxury tax on luxury cars and yachts.
Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is the only country in the developed world to increase the carbon tax during an affordability crisis. Even Japan got with the program and cancelled its plan to increase the carbon tax. The Liberals keep raising the tax, yet emissions keep going up, and they haven't hit a single emission reduction target. Even the Governor of the Bank of Canada said, axe the carbon tax and the Liberal inflation will be reduced. So why won't the Liberals stop forcing their failed carbon tax scheme on Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, last week we heard really good news for Atlantic Canadians. 3 Atlantic provinces are going to get access to the Climate Action Rebate. That's going to put more money in their pockets, Mr. Speaker. But even more good news, Mr. Speaker, hundreds of millions of dollars are going to flow into Atlantic Canada to transition from dirty, expensive fuel oil to cleaner forms of energy. Heat pumps rule, Mr. Speaker. We're making life more affordable and fighting climate change.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, that is a tax plan and not a climate plan. Their failed plan is sending more Canadians into the food bank, more families that have to skip meals. They keep on failing on the environment, they haven't fixed the economy, and they keep on charging Canadians even more. So why won't the Liberals get out of the way, give Canadians a break, and axe the tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Conservatives never met an environmental program that they didn't want to cut. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned last day that they gutted our environmental laws. They cut $350 million from the climate action budget. Mr. Speaker, for 10 long years, they did absolutely nothing on climate change, Mr. Speaker. We're on track to meet our emissions target. We're doing something about climate change. We're building the economy of tomorrow.
Member for Haldimand, Norfolk.
The Liberal carbon tax has driven up the cost of home heating, fuel, and groceries. Canadians are suffering. People are wearing their winter coats inside of their homes just to keep down heating costs. Mothers are diluting their baby's milk just to stretch it. And yet, Canada pitifully lacks and ranks 58 out of 63 countries for climate action. Will the Liberal government stop forcing their failed climate tax on suffering Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Rural Development.
Mr. Speaker, I really find it quite rich coming from the party opposite who promised a climate plan and we haven't delivered. They haven't delivered because I can tell you the people in my riding, they want action on climate right now. The impacts of Fiona are still being felt on the ground. Now add not only to the damage done to personal homes, to infrastructure and wastewater, municipal infrastructure, add 4 feet of snow to that, Mr. Speaker. My constituents want action on climate now.
The Honourable Member for Haldimand, Norfolk.
I remind the Liberal government that they are in government. They need to present a plan. This government lacks credibility when it has not met a single climate target. A tax on on the backs of average Canadians does nothing to drive down emissions. It drives up poverty. More Canadians are relying on food banks than ever before. The food banks fear that they're going to run out of food. The carbon tax is not an environmental plan. It is a tax plan. Will this government cancel their cruel carbon tax on gas, groceries, and home heating?
That's the tax. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, and yes, we are in government, and we are in government in part because we actually have a credible plan on climate. I think Canadians actually expect from His Majesty's official opposition to have a climate plan, which they clearly do not. Mr. Speaker, affordability today is critically important, but so is affordability tomorrow. We cannot leave the kinds of costs to our children that we will if we do not address climate change. The Climate Institute estimates $100 billion a year by 2050 if we do not act to mitigate carbon emissions. We are going to do so in a manner that will promote economic opportunity and address climate change.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, inflation is hitting hard in the pocketbooks of all Canadian families. Everything is more expensive. As a result, meanwhile, the government is looking to raise the Liberal carbon tax. There's one thing they need to understand. When you raise taxes in times of inflation, it pays off for the government, but not for taxpayers. When will the government finally make the right decision and scrap the carbon tax hike in these inflationary times? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We need to focus on the issue of affordability to help Canadians deal with. We need to take into account the costs of climate change, adaptation. Those costs will be in the order of $25 billion by 2025. In dealing with the question of affordability, we have to also tackle the question of climate change. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. And it's certainly not by attacking Canadians' pocketbooks that the climate problem is going to be solved. This minister, the Prime Minister rather, has made a name for himself with some harebrained economic theories like budgets balance themselves or that SMEs are being used for tax evasion. Ridiculous economic theories. But this is the first time a head of state has ever said it's a good idea to raise taxes in a period of inflation. So, is there anyone in this government who can stand up and say when they're going to scrap the carbon tax hike in times of inflation? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I find it interesting that my honourable colleague has raised the question of absurd economic theories put forward by Canadian politicians, because the most harebrained theory we've heard was the Conservative leader's recommendation that Canadians fight inflation by investing in crypto. That was a crazy idea and a dangerous one. And this is the time for all Canadians to smarten up. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, the government continues to be secretive about its decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. CSIS says the convoy wasn't a threat to national security at all, and we know it didn't meet the definition of national emergency in the Act. The only document the government says it relied on was an obscure legal opinion that the Minister of Justice is hiding. The minister, as a lawyer, may well be bound by solicitor-client privilege, but not the government, the client. If the legal opinion really justified invoking the Act in every respect, can we seriously believe the government would want to hide it? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, you have to remember that last winter we were facing an unprecedented situation. The consequences for Canadians, for workers, for families, it was all unprecedented. And after much consultation with police and other levels of government, we took the decision that was necessary. A number of ministers, including the Prime Minister, testified, and now Justice Rouleau has said he's got all the evidence he needs to make a report, and we will continue with transparency while we await that important report. The honourable member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, if the legal opinion was entirely in the Liberals' favour, there would have been hundreds of copies distributed to the media. In fact, the Liberals read the opinions, they read the Act, they saw they didn't meet the threshold to proclaim the Act, and they invoked it anyway. It was exactly to prevent this that the old War Measures Act was changed to the Emergencies Act, because it was necessary to prevent any government from saying, just watch me, and arbitrarily suspending individual freedoms. Does the government realize that it has set a dangerous precedent here? The Honourable Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I'll describe the process, the precedent we set. It was a precedent of transparency, of caution, of following the guidelines strictly, of protecting the lives and finances of Canadians. Yes, we invoked the Emergencies Act in a targeted and balanced way for 9 days, and it solved a national emergency which was threatening Canadians from coast to coast, and we're proud of the decision we made as a government. The honourable member for La Pointe de l'Île. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, the Prime Minister said, with reference to the Rouleau Commission, I think it's a shame there wasn't enough French. Obviously, I'll try to use French as much as possible so everyone can understand me in both official languages. Mr. Speaker, we were expecting the Prime Minister and we were looking forward to him setting an example and rectifying the situation on Friday, but the result was 12 short minutes. Using French as much as possible to the Liberal government, is that it? 12 minutes out of 5.5 hours? Well done. The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I appeared, I know the member is very interested in this, so I myself appeared before the Commission with the Minister of Public Safety on Tuesday. I spoke French. I answered questions asked in English. I answered in French. This government was there. We answered questions from Council, from Justice Rouleau, and we're proud of the testimony and the evidence we put forward as a government, and we're looking forward to Justice Rouleau's report.
Edmonton Mill Woods.
Mr. Speaker, my parents, like most other immigrants, came to this country for the economic opportunities available to them here. The idea that if you work hard, you can make a decent living and provide for your family. But because of this Liberals' inflation crisis caused by mismanagement and overspending of Canadians' taxpayer dollars, too many Canadians are struggling. And now they're going to triple the carbon tax and make everything more expensive. When will they cancel their plan to triple the carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister for Seniors.
Recognize the challenges that seniors are facing, and our government has been there for them. Mr. Speaker, unlike the party opposite that has opposed every single measure that we have put forward to support seniors. Mr. Speaker, we're delivering for them by doubling the GST credit that will help 11 million people. We're providing rental and dental support. We have permanently increased the old age security by 10%, Mr. Speaker, for those 75. We're going to continue to be there for seniors. Thank you.
Honourable member for Edmonton Mill Woods.
Well, here's some facts for you, Mr. Speaker. Too many Canadian families, hardworking Canadian families, are lining up at food banks just to provide food for their families. 20% of Canadians are having to skip meals just to save money. And so many Canadian families are struggling to heat their homes. And now the Liberals are going to triple the carbon tax and make everything even more expensive. So when will they cancel their plan to triple the carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to remind the member across the way what it means to stand up for Canadians. Over 2 million Canadians have been lifted out of poverty since this government has taken action. That's 450,000 families in the last year alone. Let me remind the member across the way that the Conservatives voted against and do not support the CCB that lifted 435,000 children out of poverty in this country. We're building affordable childcare system across this country. We've added $500 to low-income families renters, and we've made sure that children under 12 have dental care. Mr. Speaker, we understand what Canadian families need now and also in the future.
The honourable member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, the Ontario Superior Court has ruled that Iran's Revolutionary Guard is a terrorist entity under Canadian law. The courts have shown leadership while this government refuses to ban the IRGC. So my question is to the Attorney General. Now that the precedent has been set, will he advise all federal government departments that the IRGC is to be considered a terrorist organization under Canadian law? Will he respect the court decision, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first I want to underline that we stand with women who are marching for their rights in Iran. We stand with those who have been protesting here in Canada. We continue to engage with members of the community here because we know that this is a critical time to stand up for human rights. And Mr. Speaker, as I've said now on numerous occasions, that is why we have gone further than just looking at the IRGC as a problematic contributor to the transgression of human rights. We've targeted the entirety of the Iranian regime, Mr. Speaker, including members of the IRGC, which is a very effective tool that we can use to ensure that Canada will never be used as a safe haven for the transgression of human rights.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Speaker, healthcare in Alberta is in chaos. Kids are waiting 20 hours for care. Paramedics are overwhelmed. Nobody can find a family doctor. Now, the Alberta Children's Hospital is so overwhelmed that it's added a portable trailer in the parking lot to treat sick kids. All this while Danielle Smith is dismantling public health care and, in her own words, preparing people to pay out of pocket. The Canadian Health Act guarantees equal care for all Canadians.
I'm having a hard time hearing the question. I'm going to have to ask the honourable member to repeat it.
She meant to ask this question in the Alberta legislature.
Okay, now that everything's calmed down, I'm going to ask the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona to maybe start from the top, please.
Alberta is in chaos. Kids are waiting 20 hours for care, paramedics are overworked, and nobody can find a family doctor. And now the Alberta Children's Hospital is so overwhelmed that they've added a portable trailer in the parking lot to treat sick kids. And all this while Danielle Smith is dismantling public health care and, in her own words, saying that she's preparing us to pay out of pocket for care. The Canadian Health Act guarantees equal care for all Canadians. What is this government doing right now to protect our universal and our public health care system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think everyone in this House does feel the duty to support the Canadian Health Act, not because it's the right thing to do only, because it's the important thing to do right now. Our workers, our patients are suffering across Canada. That's why we have invested just a few months ago $2 billion extra in reducing backlogs in surgeries and treatments. That's why the CHT will increase by another 10% in March this year. That's why we are investing $3 billion for mental health, $3 billion for long-term care, and $3 billion for home care. And there'll be more, Mr. Speaker, we'll be doing over the next few weeks.
Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, our emergency rooms are overwhelmed, and Canadians with no mental health supports are having to turn to these overcrowded ERs for help. The Liberals promised that mental health care would be treated as part of Canada's universal health care system. With long wait lists for treatment and the high costs of therapy, Canadians have been left with nowhere to turn. And the cost of essentials like food, I can't even get my question off, Mr. Speaker. Like, I'm trying. Like,
deal with them.
I just want to point out, it's, if I can have your attention, please, order. And I understand that when you're close to someone, near in proximity in this chamber, it's easy to yell or shout at them, and it's not respectful. And I just want to point out the honourable member for Edmonton West. he's listening. I could see him, I could barely hear him, but it really carries well. So if he's going to heckle, maybe just heckle a different way, if he's going to heckle, but I recommend against heckling. The honourable member, finish off his question, please.
Mr. Speaker, if you don't mind, could I start it from the top? Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, the long wait list for treatment and the high cost of therapy, Canadians have been left with nowhere to turn. And the cost of essentials like food is putting even more stress on Canadians struggling with their mental health. When will the Liberals finally deliver a mental health transfer so that people can access the health services they need when they need them the most?
That's right.
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health.
Mr. Speaker, our government is working with the provinces and territories to strengthen Canada's health system. We've already made historic investments to support mental health, including $5 billion through the bilateral agreements with all provinces and territories, which is now providing $600 million on an annual basis until 2027. We know more needs to be done. Other further actions, engaging with provinces and territories and stakeholders to invest additional funding through the mental health transfer. We are also working on a comprehensive evidence-based plan, including the timely sharing of data.
Member for Surrey Newton.
Mr. Speaker, keeping our oceans safe and clean is a top priority for many British Columbians, with dozens of vessels transmitting every day in the BC waters. Protecting our oceans is of utmost importance to British Columbians. Can the Honourable Minister inform this House of further ways our government is keeping our waters safe from coast to coast to coast?
Solid question.
Well, Minister of Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from Surrey Newton for his leadership and his advocacy on behalf of the community. 10 days ago, I joined my colleagues in BC, including the Minister of Natural Resources and the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, as part of announcing $1.2 billion for the next phase of the renewed Oceans Protection Plan, which includes 29 new initiatives that will strengthen marine safety. And Mr. Speaker, our government continues to be committed to meaningful work with Indigenous peoples and coastal communities so we can ensure our oceans remain safe for all.
The honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government's carbon tax will increase the price on gas, diesel, and home heating fuel. It'll also increase the price we all pay for groceries, clothing, building materials, and school supplies. And of course, it will force many businesses to pass these costs on to consumers. An analysis done reveals that Nova Scotians will pay $2,000 more a year in 2025 and $3,100 more in 2030. Atlantic Canadians cannot afford this Liberal government's carbon tax plan. When will this Liberal government stop forcing Atlantic Canadians to accept their terrible plan?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
The honourable member talks about a terrible plan. I'll tell you what a terrible plan is not taking action on climate change. His communities and mine are both still dealing with homeowners who are cleaning up the debris in their backyards. His community and mine are both dealing with farms that have had silos torn down and farmers who are more than $100,000 out of pocket so they can feed their cattle this season. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to do what we can to reduce pollution because it's the right thing to do, but we found a way to make sure that homeowners and families are left better off. 8 out of 10 families are left better off. We also introduced a new plan that will have $5,000 upfront grants so people can reduce their power bills by installing heat pumps. It's confounding to understand why he can't support something so simple.
Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very interesting. Perhaps the member op should go speak to his own premier, who's asking Canadians to weigh in on the Liberals' punishing carbon tax on Nova Scotians. We all know the tax is going to disproportionately affect low and middle-income families and will cost as much as 14 cents or more a litre at the pumps. The No Carbon Tax for Nova Scotia petition is asking Nova Scotians to support Made in Nova Scotia plan that builds on our climate leadership, safeguards to our environment, and protect the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians. Will this Liberal government stop forcing their failed carbon tax plan on Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister.
Talks about protecting the pocketbooks of Nova Scotian, I found it interesting to have him explain to his constituents why he's voted against making sure that low-income families can afford to send their kids to the dentist. I find it interesting why he's not putting out social media posts about today's announcement that child care fees are going to be reduced by 50%. I find it interesting that he voted against a $500 supplement for low-income renters. The reality is, every step of the way since we formed government in 2015, we've had the interest of working class and middle class Canadians at heart. That'll continue to be the case. We just don't have to pollute to make sure people are better off. We can protect the environment and protect the economy at the same time.
Well, member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
I tell you what's interesting, Nova Scotia Power does not allow homes to have a heat pump as their only source of heat. I'll tell you what's interesting is that home inspectors and insurance companies in Nova Scotia won't allow heat pumps as their only source of heat. And you know why? Because the Canada Building Code prohibits them from doing so because they have to maintain a house at 20 degrees or more, which they cannot do in cold weather. So I will ask this government, will they stop their fairy tale programs and stop forcing Nova Scotians to pay for their unhelpful and fail?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Sherlock is on the case. We would never have figured this out. Holy smokes, it's unbelievable, but somebody could have a heat pump and some other source of heating as well. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is we have a new $5,000 grant. There will be an upfront payment directly to homeowners that is going to allow them to save thousands of dollars every year. It would help reduce pollution in our communities.
I'm going to have order. I just want to remind the honourable members, the protocol is you ask a question and you listen. You can't hear the answer if you're shouting. The Honourable Minister of Immigration, he's got about 15 seconds left if he wants to finish off that thought.
I will simply say, Mr. Speaker, we have found a way to save people money and reduce pollution. That's a good thing. If the Conservatives agree, I invite them to support us.
The Honourable Member for Coast of Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, between the monthly increase in mortgage payments, the price of groceries, gas to drive to work, and the cost to heat their homes, Atlantic Canadians don't know where to turn. Yet, the Maine Minister from Newfoundland and Labrador says he's sick and tired of them complaining about the cold winter. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to keep the heat on this cold-hearted minister. And I implore him to beg his old buddy, the Prime Minister, to not force this carbon tax plan down the throats of Atlantic Canadians.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, to be given yet another opportunity to tell the family of four in Newfoundland and Labrador that they will be receiving $1,312 in cold hard cash directly to their bank account 4 times a year. That's $328 starting in July, another $328 just when they're getting ready for the winter in October, and another $328 come January. I will take that as cold-heartedness. No, I will take that as good money. Cold, hard cash, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député d'Avignon-Lamétis-Matane, Matapédia.
Mr. Speaker. 1 second, please. I'll just wait for everyone to calm down.
Maintenant que tout le monde est calme.
Now that everyone is calm, I would ask the honourable member to continue.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La semaine prochaine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week, Canada's inviting the world to COP15 to discuss biodiversity. Meanwhile, in Newfoundland, 5 oil companies have been authorized to conduct exploratory drilling for finding oil in the ocean without environmental assessment. We're talking about a marine area that includes the humpback whale, blue whale, fin whale, and the right whale, an endangered species with only 336 left in the world. These species are part of the wealth of our biodiversity. So what credibility does Canada have at COP15 to talk about protecting biodiversity? The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je tiens
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to specify that any proposal for production in the areas under proposal are part of our climate plan and have to offer better performance with regards to emissions, including no net emissions by 2050. Biodiversity is a very important issue for the Government of Canada and for Canadians throughout the country.
Honorable député d'Avignon, la Métis Matapédia.
Monsieur le Président, il n'y a pas juste des balais.
Mr. Speaker, there's not just whales in those waters, there's coral too. The federal government imposes fishing restrictions to protect coral. Fishers aren't allowed to do anything that comes into contact with the seabed, but the federal government allows oil companies to dig up the seabed to find deposits to develop. Strange logic. Will the minister take advantage of COP15 to explain to us why protecting biodiversity is important for fishers, but not oil companies?
Honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
Comme j'ai dit, Monsieur le Président.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, it's very important to have a solid environmental assessment system for all projects involving oil, forestry, and other resource industries. We have a process in which we can review environmental impacts. We have set up that process, and it's very important. And that is what's going to happen with the projects that my counterpart mentioned.
For Fundy Royal.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the evidence is in, and it's not good. Violent crime is up 32%. Canada's homicide rate is at the highest it's been since 2005. And gang-related killings are on the rise. And what does this Liberal government choose to do? Rather than go after criminals and gun smugglers, they're going after farmers and duck hunters. Mr. Speaker, will the minister finally admit that the Liberal soft-on-crime approach is not working and the evidence shows it has to end?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear that we are absolutely not targeting law-abiding gun owners. The guns that we are going after are the assault rifles that were used in Portapique and Truro in Nova Scotia. The guns that we are going after are the guns that were used at the Quebec City Mosque in Quebec City. The guns that we are going after, Mr. Speaker, are the guns that were tragically used in Polytechnique. Those are the assault rifles that we are targeting in Bill C-21, and it would just be time now for the Conservatives to stop filibustering and study this bill, debate this bill, and pass this bill so that we can end gun violence once and for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Niagara Falls.
Speaker, these Liberals have failed to make life easier for violent criminals by repealing mandatory minimums. Many of these mandatory minimums were implemented by this Prime Minister's father. They failed to stem the tide of illegal handguns coming across the border, including those 4 breaches in Niagara. Mr. Speaker, it's been mentioned before. Violent crime is up 32%. Stats Canada now reports homicide rate is up 3%. Speaker, when will they begin protecting Canadians and end their soft approach on crime?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to talk about our very smart criminal justice policy. Mr. Speaker, serious crimes will always have serious consequences. Bill C-5 is moving past failed policies of the Conservative era, who clogged our justice system and filled our prisons with low-risk first-time offenders. Time and resources that should be devoted to fighting serious crimes, Mr. Speaker. In fact, former Supreme Court Justice Moldover, whom no one can accuse of being soft on crime, recently stressed the need for different approach to less serious offenses. Our communities are not safer for it, Mr. Speaker.
Le député de Charbot-Haute-Saint-Charles.
Monsieur le Président, selon un sondage.
Mr. Speaker, according to a survey, 84% of Quebecers are concerned about the surge in violence in the Greater Montreal area. The 2021 annual report by the Montreal Police confirms that crimes against people are up by more than 17% compared to the average over the last 5 years. Crimes are being committed with illegal firearms by criminals, not hunters. Will the Liberals finally do the right thing and deal with violent criminals, protect Canadians, and leave our hunters alone? The Honourable Minister.
Président, je partageais les préoccupations.
Mr. Speaker, I share the concerns of my colleague. That is exactly why in our fall economic update, we added $138 million to provide tools and resources to interrupt the traffic of illegal weapons at our border. That's why Bill C-21 gave more tools to target criminal organizations and stop the terrorism they're visiting on communities with firearms. It's time for the Conservatives to stop their arguing about it.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons...
Mr. Speaker, we've seen a substantial increase in cases of the flu and RSV compared to previous years. Recent Canadian studies have shown that vaccination coverage declined during the pandemic. Vaccinations for measles, mumps, and rubella. This year's flu season is particularly dangerous for young children and the elderly. Many parents in my constituency are worried about their children's health. Can the Minister of Health please tell the House about the importance, the Minister of Health? Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for her question and her hard work. We obviously share the same concerns about getting people vaccinated. We're worried about teachers and children. We're worried about what's happening at hospitals and in pediatric care units. That's why I want to talk about the benefits of vaccination. Vaccinations work, they're free throughout the country, and they're accessible as well to all adults and children. Let's take advantage of it to protect our families and communities.
Barry Innisfil.
Feels like everything is broken in Canada because of this Prime Minister and this Liberal government. And why should anyone be surprised? It's part of the Liberal playbook not to unite Canadians, but to divide them. And the Prime Minister has been very effective at pitting Canadians against each other. Imagine a Prime Minister calling his own citizens racist, misogynist, and extremists for not agreeing to his political ideology or his politics. Canadians are losing their hopes, their dreams, and their dignity. Does the Prime Minister not realize that he's here to serve and unite Canadians, not divide them like he's been doing for the last 7 years?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And look, the reality was that in the previous Conservative government, they actually created a playbook to show how you could divide Canadians and divide committees and play the kind of games that he's talking about. But what we saw at the Emergencies Act Commission, which I believe what the honourable member was referring to, was a government that faced a critical challenge in this country, where our infrastructure was besieged, where Ottawa faced an illegal blockade, and while the Conservatives were going and getting Tim Hortons and donuts to those people who are illegally protesting and blocking a critical infrastructure, we were doing the hard work of keep Canadians.
L'honorable député de Bellechasse et Échemins-Lévis.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government is afraid of chaos. There are protests showing against inflation. 1.5 million Canadians have had to use food banks in a single month. Pregnant women have to choose between feeding themselves or feeding their children. People are fed up. This Liberal government needs to stop making daily life complicated for Canadians. And will they let them breathe a little bit by backing down on their carbon tax? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know that many Canadians are facing very real difficulties due to inflation. That's why we have a responsible, compassionate plan. That's what we're implementing. We've doubled the GST tax credit. We're giving money to people who need it to pay their rent. We're helping parents with dental care. And we're increasing the Canada Workers' Benefit. These are necessary and important measures for Canadians. And the Conservatives should support us. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Échemins-Lévis. It's not working, Mr. Speaker. The cost of housing has doubled since this Liberal government took power. Young families are giving up on their dream of home ownership. Students have to sleep in shelters. It's happening here in Canada, a G7 country. It's shameful. It's embarrassing. When will the government let people take back control over their lives? The Honourable Deputy Minister. Mr. Speaker, we know full well that Canadians are having difficulties today because of the worldwide economic situation. That is why we have set up a plan to help Canadians. We're improving the GST tax credit. We're helping out with student loans and improving the Canada Workers' Benefit. If the Conservatives really want to help Canadians, they have to support our plan.
For Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, global food insecurity has been growing for the last several years, but it has been brought to a critical level because of Russia's genocidal war in Ukraine and Russia blocking the food exports from Ukraine that feed hundreds of millions of people in countries around the world. As a result, countless people in countries around the world are facing food shortages and are facing starvation, with the vulnerable suffering the most. Could the Minister of International Development speak to what Canada is doing to fight food shortages and to fight starvation around the world?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of International Development.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from Etobicoke Centre for raising this very important issue. Now, despite the challenges Ukrainians face, they continue to look beyond their borders in supporting the fight against hunger in the global south. Our government commends Ukraine on its commitment to donating grain to help address the global food crisis as part of its Grain from Ukraine humanitarian initiative. This is why Canada is providing $30 million to the World Food Program to facilitate additional shipments of Ukrainian grain moving through the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And with our partners, we will continue to look at ways on how we can make sure that food is available for the most vulnerable. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Wednesday, childcare workers and advocates are holding a day of action. Their message? That childcare staff are worth more than they are being paid. As a former childhood educator, I know firsthand how inadequate pay and benefits make recruiting and retaining staff more difficult, and the biggest barriers to expanding licensed childcare and improving access is the shortage of childcare staff. Will the Liberals ensure that the federal childcare funding is used for livable wages and good benefits for childcare workers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Full Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for her advocacy for a national child care system so that we can make sure that every child in Canada gets the right start in life. Mr. Speaker, we continue, through every agreement that we sign with the provinces and territories across this country, we continue to work with them year by year with the agreements that we have in place to ensure that there is high-quality staff that are well paid for their work in the daycare system. As we expand spaces, we will expand staff, and we work with our provincial counterparts to make sure that all our network of systems, our childcare systems, are working for the best, in the best interest of our kids.
The Honourable Member for Spadina Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, the actions of Iranian and Chinese operatives in Canada has received a pathetic response from this government. Canada has become a doormat for foreign interference. Is the government aware of Article 41.1 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations? It states that all persons enjoying privileges and immunities in Canada have a duty to, and I quote, respect the laws and regulations of the receiving state. They also have a duty not to interfere in the internal affairs of that state. Mr. Speaker, other nations expel pseudo-diplomats and agents. Does the government even understand the concept of persona non grata?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. I want to be unequivocally clear that the government has taken decisive actions in sanctioning the Iranian regime, including most recently using a sparingly used provision under the IRPA Act to ensure that no one in the most senior echelons of the regime can set foot here or use Canada in any way as a safe haven to advance their transgression of human rights or terrorist activities. Mr. Speaker, we will stand with women in Iran. We will stand with all those who are protesting. We will stand with the community to stand up for human rights both here and around the world. Thank you very much.
That's all the time we have today for questions. C'est tout le temps que nous avons. We'll continue with the operations of the House. Si je peux avoir votre attention.
If
I may have your attention, please.